The town of Black Hollow had long been abandoned, its streets swallowed by creeping vines and suffocating silence. No one spoke of why it had been left to rot, only that it was best forgotten. But Michael Hayes didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a historian, and the allure of a town wiped from history's pages was too much to ignore. The drive into Black Hollow was uneventful at first. Thick fog slithered between skeletal trees, and the deeper he drove, the more he felt an unsettling tightness in his chest. The road narrowed, cracks in the pavement deepening into gaping wounds that swallowed the light from his car's headlights. He reached the town limits at dusk. The sign was still standing, half buried in overgrown weeds. Footnote: Welcome to Black Hollow, population tilde. The number had been scratched out. Michael stepped out of his car, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. He adjusted his camera and stepped forward, the sound of his own breathing too loud in the unnatural quiet. Buildings loomed ahead, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets, their walls sagging under the weight of time. The main street was lined with broken-down shops, rusted streetlights bent at odd angles, as if something enormous had twisted them like soft metal. And yet, there was something off. The town didn't feel empty. Somewhere, behind one of those shattered windows, something was watching. Michael swallowed, shaking off the irrational fear. He moved forward, camera raised, snapping photos of the eerie remnants of civilization. His footsteps crunched against the gravel, the only sound in a town suffocated by silence. Then the whisper came. It was soft, almost playful, just behind him. He turned sharply, breath hitching. Nothing, but something had changed. The buildings looked closer. Michael blinked, heart hammering against his ribs. He was imagining it. He had to be. He kept moving, snapping more pictures, the weight of unseen eyes pressing heavier against his shoulders. Then he saw the first marking. A handprint smeared in something dark, staining the glass of a store window. He stepped closer. It was too large to be human. The fingers were too long, curling slightly at the tips, like claws. He felt a vibration against his chest. His phone. One new message. His stomach dropped. There was no signal out here. He hesitated before unlocking his phone. The message had no sender, just 3 words. Wow. Why did you come? Michael exhaled sharply, his fingers shaking as he pocketed the phone. He was done. He had enough photos. He turned back toward his car, picking up his pace. The street wasn't the same. The buildings had shifted. They loomed over him now, their angles wrong, as if they had turned when he wasn't looking. The streetlights flickered, their rusted bulbs pulsing like dying stars. And then, a door slammed somewhere behind him. The noise shattered the silence like glass. Michael broke into a run. His car was just ahead, just a few more feet. Something stepped into his path. A silhouette. Tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at a sharp angle, as if studying him. The dim light from the flickering street lamp barely touched it, but he could see enough. Its mouth was wrong, too wide, too full of teeth. It didn't move, but the whisper did. It came from all around him, a chorus of hushed voices hissing the same question over and over. "Why did you come?" Michael stumbled backward, his breath ragged. He turned, heart slamming against his ribs. The buildings were even closer now, as if the town itself was caging him in. Then the shadows moved. Not just one, dozens. They stepped out of doorways, unfurling from alleyways, their elongated bodies twitching as they emerged. Faceless, silent, hungry. Michael ran. He sprinted down the narrowing street, his car now nothing more than a distant blur. The shadows moved unnaturally fast, their limbs jerking as they closed in. The whispers grew frantic. "You shouldn't be here." A cold, skeletal hand grasped his wrist. He screamed, yanking himself free. The skin where it touched burned, frostbite spreading through his veins. His car, so close. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut, hands fumbling for the keys. The shadows pressed against the windows, their outlines shifting, melting, reforming. He twisted the key. The engine roared to life. The things outside didn't move. They just watched. Michael hit the gas. Tires screeched against the broken pavement as he tore down the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The town's exit was just ahead. He could see the warped sign in his headlights. And then his phone buzzed. His gaze flicked to the screen for 1 second. One new message. He looked back at the road. The figure was standing in the middle of it, right in front of him. Too late to stop. The car collided, but there was nothing there. The impact never came. Michael gasped, his hands locked on the wheel, his body shaking. The town was behind him now. The road stretched out endlessly into the dark woods. His phone buzzed again. He looked down. A photo. His own car, still parked in Black Hollow. The message below it made his blood run cold. "You never left." His headlights flickered. The road ahead was gone. Only Black Hollow remained, and the shadows were waiting. You never leave Black Hollow. No one does. The darkness swallowed Michael Hayes whole. One moment he had been driving, escaping, but now the road had disappeared and Black Hollow had claimed him. His car wasn't moving anymore. The engine still hummed, but the world beyond the windshield was nothing but suffocating blackness. The trees were gone, the road was gone, even the sky had disappeared. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He reached for his phone, but his fingers trembled so violently that he could barely hold it. The last message was still on the screen. "You never left." His reflection in the glass twisted. Michael turned his head sharply. The rearview mirror. He wished he hadn't looked. The back seat wasn't empty anymore. A figure sat there, motionless. It was him, but it wasn't. His double sat with its hands folded neatly in its lap, wearing the exact same clothes, the same dirt-stained jacket, the same wide-eyed look of terror. But its skin was wrong, too pale, too stretched, as if it barely fit over the bones underneath. Its lips parted slowly, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. Then it spoke. "Drive." Michael's pulse slammed in his ears. His foot hit the gas instinctively, but the car didn't move. It was as if the wheels had melted into the road itself. His double tilted its head too far until something cracked. Its mouth widened into an almost inhuman grin. "Drive." Michael yanked the door handle and threw himself out. The moment his body hit the pavement, he realized he wasn't on a road anymore. He was on a floor, a wooden one. A house. No, his mother's house. Michael staggered to his feet, his breath heaving. The walls around him were too tall, stretching into an endless black ceiling that seemed to breathe. The furniture was wrong. Too perfect, like a recreation of something remembered rather than real. And then he heard it. Boom, boom, boom. The knocking, not from the door, from inside the walls. A whisper slid through the air, soft and cold. "You were supposed to stay gone." Michael turned sharply. The voice came from the hallway, from the shadows that shifted even though there was no wind. He forced himself forward, heart hammering. The house was waiting. He walked past rooms that shouldn't exist. His childhood bedroom, untouched since he was a boy. The kitchen where his mother had once stood, humming a tune he had long since forgotten. But these weren't memories. They were traps. Then he saw it. The door at the end of the hallway. It hadn't been there before. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness leaking from inside. The air recoiled around it, as if the very house was afraid of what lay beyond. Michael stepped closer. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, the lights died. Pitchback swallowed everything. And then, footsteps, slow, dragging, coming closer. Michael backed away, his breath a choked gasp. He couldn't see, couldn't move, could only listen as the thing in the dark breathed. Then, right next to his ear, "You've never left." Cold fingers wrapped around his wrist. Michael screamed. The light returned in a violent flash, flooding the room in sickly yellow. He was no longer in the hallway. He was outside, or at least it looked like outside. The town of Black Hollow stretched around him, but it was wrong. The buildings were taller, their edges sharpened like jagged teeth. The streetlights flickered, but not with electricity, with something alive. Aida! And the people, they weren't people. Figures stood in the windows, their silhouettes warped and shifting. Some were too tall, some too wide, their bodies twisting in unnatural ways. What? Michael staggered back. His mother's house was gone, replaced by a faceless wall of darkness. And then the figures moved. A single step forward, then another. Michael turned to run. The road was gone. It was only him and them. And then the whispers started again. Soft, crawling, inside his mind. "Why didn't you come back?" The shadows swarmed. Hands cold and skeletal reached for him. He thrashed, his voice lost in the void. He tried to move, but they held him down, pressing him into the ground, into the town itself. His phone buzzed again. He managed to glimpse the screen. A photo of himself, standing with them, and the message below it. "You belong to us now." The last thing Michael saw before the darkness swallowed him was his own face, smiling. No one leaves Black Hollow, not even you. In the isolated coastal town of Blackwater Bay, where the fog rolls in thick from the sea and the waves crash against jagged cliffs, there is a chilling legend that has been whispered for generations. It is the tale of the drowned congregation, a cult that vanished without a trace over a century ago. The townsfolk speak of eerie lights seen beneath the waves and mournful hymns carried by the wind, a haunting reminder of the town's dark past. A group of 5 friends, Samantha, a curious and determined marine biologist, Caleb, a pragmatic and skeptical historian, Ilara, a sensitive and intuitive musician, Finn, a daring and adventurous diver, and Iris, a compassionate and empathetic nurse, decide to visit Blackwater Bay. They are drawn by the mystery of the drowned congregation and the promise of uncovering secrets long buried beneath the ocean's depths. The town is a stark contrast to the bustling cities they are used to. The streets are narrow and winding, lined with weathered cottages and shops that seem to have been frozen in time. The air is thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, and the constant sound of the sea is both comforting and unsettling. The friends check into a quaint bed and breakfast overlooking the harbor. The innkeeper, a stoic woman with a face weathered by the sea, greets them with a nod and a warning. Beware the tides and the songs they sing. Her words hang in the air, a cryptic message that piques their curiosity. As night falls, the friends gather in the parlor, the room filled with the soft glow of oil lamps. Ilara, ever the musician, is drawn to an old piano in the corner. She plays a few notes, and the room is filled with a haunting melody, one that seems to resonate with something deep within the house. The melody is interrupted by a sudden, loud knocking at the door. Caleb, ever the historian, answers it to find a weathered old man standing on the porch. The man introduces himself as Gideon, the town's unofficial historian and keeper of its secrets. Gideon tells the friends about the drowned congregation, a cult that worshipped an ancient sea deity known as Dagon. The cult believed that by drowning themselves, they could achieve eternal life beneath the waves. One stormy night over a century ago, the entire congregation walked into the sea, never to be seen again. The friends are intrigued and decide to investigate further. They visit the town archives, where Caleb uncovers old documents and maps that reveal the location of the cult's meeting place, a hidden cove accessible only at low tide. The friends decide to explore the cove, hoping to find clues about the cult's fate. As they make their way across the rocky shoreline, the sky darkens and a thick fog rolls in, obscuring their path. The cove is a place of stark beauty and foreboding. The cliffs rise sharply from the sea, and the air is filled with the sound of crashing waves and the cries of seabirds. As they explore, they discover an entrance to a cave, its mouth partially submerged by the rising tide. Inside the cave, they find remnants of the cult's rituals, altars made of stone, rusted lanterns, and tattered banners bearing the symbol of Dagon. The air is cold and damp, and the walls seem to close in around them. Suddenly, they hear a faint, eerie hymn echoing through the cave. The melody is haunting, and it seems to be coming from the depths of the sea. The friends exchange worried glances, their unease growing. As they follow the sound, they discover a hidden chamber deep within the cave. The chamber is filled with water, and in the center, a stone altar rises above the surface. The hymn grows louder, and the friends feel a presence, something ancient and malevolent, watching them from the shadows. Samantha, ever the marine biologist, notices strange symbols carved into the altar. They are unlike anything she has ever seen, and they seem to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. As she examines them, the water around the altar begins to churn and bubble. The friends realize that they have disturbed something, a force that has lain dormant for centuries. The hymn reaches a crescendo, and the chamber is filled with a blinding light. When the light fades, the friends find themselves in a twisted version of the cove, a nightmarish reflection of the world they know. The sea is dark and foreboding, and the air is filled with the screams of the damned. The friends are confronted by the spirits of the drowned congregation, their faces twisted in agony and despair. The spirits speak as one, their voices a haunting chorus that echoes through the cove. "You have come to join us," they intone, their words sending shivers down the friends' spines. The sea demands its sacrifice. The friends realize that they are trapped in a cycle of suffering, a nightmare from which there is no escape. They must confront the malevolent force that controls the cove and break the curse that binds the congregation. Using their unique strengths and abilities, the friends fight against the darkness. Samantha's knowledge of the sea helps her understand the nature of the entity. Caleb's historical research provides insight into the cult's rituals. Ilara's music provides a beacon of hope and sanity. Finn's diving skills allow him to navigate the treacherous waters. Iris's empathy allows her to connect with the spirits and find a way to free them. In the end, the friends succeed in breaking the curse and freeing the spirits of the drowned congregation. The nightmare fades, and they find themselves back in the cave, the sea calm and the air filled with a sense of peace. The friends leave Blackwater Bay, forever changed by their experience. They have faced the abyss and emerged victorious, their bonds stronger than ever. As they drive away, they know that they will never forget the terror and the wonder of the drowned congregation, but they also know that they have made a difference and that they have helped to free the souls trapped beneath the waves. After their harrowing ordeal in Blackwater Bay, Samantha, Caleb, Ilara, Finn, and Iris tried to return to their normal lives. They had broken the curse of the drowned congregation and freed the spirits trapped beneath the waves, but the experience had left its mark on them, a lingering sense of unease that refused to fade. Months passed, and the friends tried to move on. They went their separate ways, each one hoping to find some semblance of peace. But the memories of the drowned congregation haunted them, creeping into their thoughts and dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced. Samantha, the marine biologist, found herself drawn to the ocean like never before. She spent countless hours on research vessels, studying the sea and its mysteries. But the more she learned, the more she felt a presence beneath the waves, a force that seemed to be calling to her. Caleb, the historian, delved into the town's history, searching for any clues that might explain the events they had experienced. He uncovered old records and documents, but each discovery only led to more questions. His dreams were filled with visions of the drowned, their faces twisted in despair. Ulara, the musician, found her music taking on a dark and haunting quality. Her compositions were filled with eerie melodies and unsettling harmonies, as if the song of the drowned congregation had seeped into her art. Her dreams were plagued by nightmares, and she often felt a malevolent presence in her studio. Finn, the diver, tried to return to his adventurous lifestyle, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He began to experience strange occurrences underwater, objects moving on their own and shadows flitting across his vision. His dreams were filled with visions of the sea, its depths filled with unknown horrors. Iris, the nurse, felt the pain and suffering of those around her more acutely than ever before. She was constantly bombarded by the emotions of others, and she struggled to maintain her own sense of self. Her dreams were filled with the cries of the lost and the damned, and she often felt a presence near her, a whisper of the past. The friends were brought together again by a shared sense of foreboding. They gathered at a remote coastal cabin, a place where they hoped to find some solace and clarity. As they sat around the fireplace, they shared their experiences, each one more bizarre and terrifying than the last. Samantha spoke of the presence she felt beneath the waves, a force that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. She had begun to suspect that the drowned congregation was not the only entity that lurked in the ocean's depths. Caleb described the research he had conducted, the old records and documents he had uncovered. He had learned that the drowned congregation was not the first cult to worship Dagon, and that the deity's influence stretched far beyond the shores of Blackwater Bay. Elara shared her music with the group, and the friends were both captivated and disturbed by her compositions. The melodies were haunting and beautiful, yet they seemed to carry a malevolent energy that resonated with something deep within them. Finn spoke of the strange occurrences he had experienced underwater, the objects moving on their own and the shadows flitting across his vision. He had begun to suspect that the sea was alive, a sentient force that was aware of their presence. Iris shared her experiences with the group, the pain and suffering she felt from those around her. She had begun to see visions of the drowned, their faces twisted in despair, and she felt a pull, a force drawing her back to the ocean. As the friends discussed their experiences, they realized that the drowned congregation was not the only threat they had to contend with. They began to experience strange occurrences, as if the other realm was closing in on them. Samantha's research led her to an ancient shipwreck, a vessel that had been lost to the sea for centuries. As she explored the wreck, she discovered a strange artifact, a conch shell that seemed to hum with a low, ominous energy. Caleb's research uncovered a pattern of disappearances and strange occurrences that coincided with the appearance of the drowned congregation. He realized that the cult was part of a larger network of cults and secret societies, all worshiping dark and ancient deities. Elara's music began to affect those around her in more disturbing ways, driving some to madness and others to despair. She felt a presence in her studio, a shadow that seemed to watch her as she composed. Finn's strange occurrences grew more frequent and more intense. He began to see visions of the sea, its depths filled with monstrous creatures and unknown horrors. He felt a pull, a force drawing him deeper into the ocean. Iris's visions of the drowned grew more vivid and more frequent. She felt a presence near her, a shadow that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She began to suspect that the presence was the embodiment of the drowned congregation, a malevolent force that was determined to claim her. The friends realized that they had to confront the other realm once again if they were to have any hope of escaping its grasp. They returned to Blackwater Bay, hoping to find answers and a way to break the connection that bound them to the Dagon. As they arrived in the town, they were greeted by a sight that chilled them to the bone. The town was in chaos, the streets filled with twisted figures and otherworldly creatures. The air was thick with the scent of decay and despair. The friends made their way to the harbor, where they found the conch shell they had discovered in the shipwreck. The shell was pulsating with a malevolent energy, and the air was filled with the echoes of the Dagon's song. The friends stood together, determined to face the abyss once more. They used their unique strengths and abilities, each one supporting the others in their darkest moments. They confronted the malevolent force that controlled the sea, and they fought with everything they had. In the end, the friends emerged victorious, the connection to the other realm severed, and the Dagon banished back to the depths of the ocean. The town of Blackwater Bay was restored to its former state, and the friends were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had faced the abyss and survived, but they knew that they would never be the same. The experience had changed them, leaving them with a bond forged in the crucible of adversity and a strength that they never knew they had. As they left Blackwater Bay, they vowed to keep the memory of the drowned congregation alive, to warn others of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. They had learned that the Dagon was not just a deity, but a living entity, a force of chaos and destruction. The friends returned to their lives, but they knew that they would always be connected by the shared experience of the abyss. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger, their friendship a testament to the power of unity and the resilience of the human spirit. The forest was never meant to be entered. The people of Cold Creek knew that, lived by it, feared it. The town sat in the valley, wrapped by towering pines that swallowed the sunlight long before the rest of the world saw night. The trees whispered when the wind passed through, but it never sounded like the wind. It sounded like voices, calling, pleading, warning. No one went in, not after what happened last time. But Carter didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a journalist, and he had spent his career debunking urban legends, traveling to forgotten places, exposing the fears of small-town folk for what they really were. Just myths. And Cold Creek's story, it was one of the best. An entire hunting party disappeared back in 1957. No bodies were found. The search teams that followed never returned. A few rescuers stumbled out weeks later, but they wouldn't talk, wouldn't even open their mouths, just sat there, staring at the trees, their lips stitched shut with something unseen. The town built a fence around the forest after that, left it untouched. buried the past under warnings and folklore. Carter wanted the truth. So, at exactly 11:57 p.m., he climbed the rusted gate and stepped into the forest that should not be entered. The air changed immediately. The cold bit through his jacket, his breath rising in thick clouds. The trees stretched taller than they should, their trunks gnarled and knotted like clutching hands. The wind died completely, leaving only an unnatural silence pressing in from all sides. Then the whispers began. Not the wind through the branches. These were real voices. They slithered through the trees, low and curling, brushing against his ears. Turn around. Go back. You are not welcome. Carter's hands clenched around his flashlight. He pressed forward. The ground beneath his boots grew soft, like something alive shifting under the earth. The deeper he went, the more wrong it felt. The sky had disappeared, swallowed by the canopy, but when he looked up, there were no leaves, just darkness. Then he saw the first body. It was hanging from the branches, tangled in vines. A hunter's skeletal remains, mouth locked in a permanent scream, hollow sockets gazing at nothing. Carter's stomach lurched. Then the bones twitched. He stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. The whispers grew louder. You shouldn't be here. They're awake. Run. Something cracked behind him. A footstep. Slow, deliberate. Carter swung his flashlight. Nothing. But the trees had moved. They were closer. The path behind him was gone. A figure stood in the distance. Not a person, something wearing the idea of a person. Its limbs were too long, its face too smooth, its mouth stretched too wide in a grin that never ended. It didn't move. It just watched. Carter's breath came in short gasps. He wasn't alone. The trees rustled. Not from the wind, from something else. Dozens of figures stepped forward from the shadows, their bodies bending in unnatural angles, their heads tilted, their grins matching the thing that stood ahead. Then, in perfect unison, they ran at him. Carter turned and bolted. The branches snapped around him, clawing at his skin, dragging against his jacket. The whispers had become screams, but they weren't coming from the figures anymore. They were inside his head. We told you to leave. I need you. You are already one of them. His flashlight flickered. Then, darkness. The ground disappeared beneath him. He fell. Carter woke up in the middle of town. His face was pressed against the pavement, his body aching, his fingers still clenched around the dead flashlight. The sun was up. Had he imagined it? Had he blacked out? He pushed himself up. People were staring, whispering. Carter's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but his fingers wouldn't move right. His arms felt wrong. His skin felt wrong. Then he saw it. His shadow. It wasn't his. It was too tall. Its arms stretched too long. And when he turned his head, his reflection in the store window didn't follow. He just grinned. Welcome home, Carter. Carter hadn't been the same since he left the forest. No one in town spoke to him anymore. They only watched. Everywhere he went, the diner, the gas station, the streets, people stared at him with two wide eyes, whispering under their breath, their lips barely moving. Some faces were familiar, others he didn't recognize. But the worst part? He was starting to forget himself. His name felt foreign on his tongue. His reflection in mirrors was slower than it should have been, always a fraction of a second behind. Sometimes it moved when he didn't. Sometimes he smiled, and at night the whispers returned. "You were chosen, Carter. The forest still calls you. They need you to come back." He barely slept. His body felt lighter, like he was slowly fading into something else. He hadn't touched his phone since the night he came back. It wouldn't turn on. Or maybe it didn't recognize him anymore. Something had followed him out of those woods, and it wasn't finished with him yet. He woke up at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of scraping. His eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black. Something was inside his house. The noise was coming from the walls. Slow, deliberate scratching, like nails against wood. His breath shallowed. He reached for the bedside lamp. The bulb shattered. Glass rained down on his sheets. The whispering surged. "You have to remember, you were never meant to leave. Debbie, you're already here?" His heart pounded. He turned toward the bedroom door, and it was open. He hadn't left it open. The hallway was too dark. A figure stood in the doorway. It was him. Carter froze. The thing in the doorway was his exact reflection. Same clothes, same face, but the eyes, black, endless voids. It tilted its head too far, cracking at an unnatural angle. Then it smiled. The whispering turned into laughter. Carter lunged for the window. He didn't know why, but every nerve in his body screamed, "Run." His fingers fumbled with the latch. Behind him, the floor creaked. He threw himself through the window. Glass shattered around him as he hit the ground outside. His knees buckled, pain shooting up his legs. Blood dripped from his hands. The night was wrong. The air felt too thick, like he was moving through something alive. And the trees were closer than before. They were waiting. A voice spoke behind him. Not a whisper, not laughter, but his own voice. "You can't run from yourself, Carter." Slowly, he turned. The thing wearing his face stood on the porch, watching. Then, it stepped forward, and another Carter stepped out of the shadows. Then another, and another, until the yard was full of them. All grinning, all waiting. He backed away. His breath came in sharp gasps. The ground beneath him shifted. No, not the ground, but shadows. Hands emerged from the dirt. Too many hands, clawing, reaching, grasping. "Come home, Carter." He screamed. The world collapsed. Carter woke up. The sun was shining through his window. His bedroom looked normal. The floor was clean. The lamp was still intact. Had it been a dream? He sat up. His hands were shaking. Then, his phone buzzed. A notification. His phone had been dead for days. Slowly, he picked it up. The screen was cracked. The message was from an unknown number. It wasn't a dream. His stomach twisted. His gaze shifted to the mirror across the room. His reflection was already smiling. Waiting, Carter had stopped fighting it. It was useless to resist when the world no longer felt real. His reflection still didn't move the way it should. His voice sounded strange, like it didn't quite belong to him anymore. His memories were fractured, pieces missing, pieces replaced. He couldn't remember his childhood home, but he could remember the trees. He couldn't recall his mother's voice, but he could hear the whispers. Always the whispers. Carter wasn't sure if he had ever truly left the forest, or if the forest had come with him. The town was different now, not in a way he could explain, but in a way he could feel. The streets stretched too far, houses shifted places when he wasn't looking, and the people, God, the people, they were wrong. At first it was subtle. They blinked less often. Their skin looked too smooth, too still. But now they didn't talk. They just stood in doorways, in the middle of streets, watching Carter with empty, black eyes. And at night, they whispered, not in words, not in voices, but in movement, limbs bending in unnatural angles, heads tilting too far. It wasn't his town anymore. It wasn't his world anymore. Carter tried to leave. He packed his car, gripped the wheel, and drove as fast as he could. The highway should have taken him out of Cold Creek, but after an hour, he passed a familiar gas station. And after another hour, he passed it again. He turned off at a random exit, followed the road through endless trees, and somehow he ended up back in town, back where he started. The townspeople stood in the streets, their heads all tilted at the same angle, their mouths opened too wide, grinning, waiting. Carter locked his doors. His phone buzzed. New message. You can't leave, Carter. You never could. He dropped the phone like it burned him. His breath came fast, his skin slick with sweat. Then he noticed something in the rearview mirror, something sitting in the back seat, watching, smiling. Carter didn't turn around. He floored the gas pedal. His own laughter filled the car. Only he wasn't the one laughing. The next morning, Carter woke up in his bed. His car was parked perfectly outside. His keys were in their usual spot, as if he had never left. But his hands were covered in dirt, like he had been digging. The whispers slithered through the walls. You're ready now. The change is almost complete. Come home, Carter. His body didn't feel like his anymore. His bones ached, his skin stretched too tight. He walked to the mirror, already knowing what he would see. Not a reflection, not anymore. A copy. A version of him that wasn't him. It grinned too wide. But it stepped forward, out of the mirror. Carter didn't scream, because he understood now. He had never really escaped the forest. He had never really been Carter. Not since that night. Not since he let them in. And now, he belonged to them.